Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Welcome, listeners. Oh, this is so fun. We have a break in our as seen programming around hot topics and DEI to have a guest back with us this week. So we've got Dr. Suzanne Wertheim, and she is a former professor of linguistic anthropology and a national expert on inclusive language. She's had faculty positions at Northwestern, University of Maryland, UCLA, and she just left academia to start her own consultancy and wrote a gem of a new book that we're going to talk about today. Dr. Wertheim applies social science to real-world problems. It gives people access to useful concepts that were once stuck behind academic walls. Her new book, which I have in my hand, and I absolutely love it, and I have it earmarked all over the place with Post-it notes, her new book is The Inclusive Language Field Guide, which gives easy and practical ways to improve your communication skills so you can avoid those painful mistakes and be both persuasive and respectful at the same time. Just love this work. Suzanne, welcome to the show.
Julie, it is genuinely a pleasure to be here. And as I was saying before we turned the mics on officially, I feel like we've been seeing each other online for really a really long time. And I can't believe this is the first time we're actually talking. So I'm glad that my book is an excuse to finally get us together.
I couldn't agree more. I've followed your content for years. I think it was Karen Catlin's newsletter that got me to really dive in because she gave such great tips when the book came out. And I thought, she's somebody I really, after reading the book, I was like, I need to know her, not just know her from afar. So the feeling is very much mutual. And what I love about your guide and what we talk about a lot on this podcast is how to make DEI practical for the everyday leader, the everyday person that's like, I don't want to be a bad person. I don't want to bumble and stumble and make that mistake, but I don't know what I don't know. And so maybe, Suzanne, just kick us off first with, you've come up with some principles of inclusive language in the book. And I'd love just to start there as a landing place. And then you're a linguist, right? You've studied this for a long time. So you have deep expertise in language. So we'll dive into some of the ins and outs, if you will,
Right.
and the do's and don'ts. But tell us, what are those 6 principles and how did you come up with them?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with how I came up with them. So I have done research in multiple languages and multiple locations. And when you're a professor of linguistics and linguistic anthropology, like I have been, you end up going to conferences where people who have gone to locations bring back information from their work. So this book is informed by data from probably at least 100 languages in multiple places, right? So I'm saying that because what's funny is that the principles are so simple. I think something that happens with a lot of us is that when you dive deeper and deeper and deeper into something, you end up coming out the other end with something that's actually a very simple framework that then we can flesh out with incredibly complex things. So I will now, having given you that backup, this is what we call, I'll say, cross-linguistic and cross-cultural data, right? It's not just based on the US, and it's not just based on English, and it's not just based on American English, even though that's the focus of the book. So my 6 principles are: reflect reality, show respect, draw people in, incorporate other perspectives, prevent erasure, and recognize pain points. And that's it. So if you want to be inclusive with your language, you just need to get a grip of those 6 principles, and then you can use them as your North Star to navigate for the rest of your life, really, because it allows you to be self-correcting, do your own research, ask the right questions of people, and really understand why something that's okay for you isn't landing great for somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I like about it is it's kind of like, I looked at it as like filters.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's these like cringy moments that happen sometimes. And honestly, it's usually from really well-intentioned people that just say or do something that doesn't land in the way that they had hoped.
Mm,
And so when I can go through those filters, is it a respect issue? Is it inviting somebody? Then it gets to the heart of where the disconnect is for them. And it makes it much more easy to coach them on how that could be more inclusive using those kind of guides and filters. It kind of reminds me of like universal design principles
exactly.
a little bit.
No, it's 100% based on which are things that I talk about. So this book is, I guess, part of my larger project which is the same project that I'm sure you have, which is moving workplaces to what I call the optimized workplace, right? So an optimized workplace, it's my starting slide in almost every talk I give or workshop I give. I'm like, what are we aiming for? Because a lot of people feel that DEI is special treatment or is only benefiting some people. And I'm like, okay, look, I read a gazillion business case studies about what makes a good place where people are innovative and they work together well and you have high retention levels. And so it's exactly aligned with DEI principles, right? It's a place where everybody feels seen, heard, and valued, where they feel like they belong, where they have high levels of trust in each other and feel that they're trusted, and where they're not blocked from making contributions, right? So the optimized workplace is like universal design. Everybody likes to work there, everybody. And I feel like inclusive language is the same way. If you're careful, um, everybody likes inclusive language because it lands well on everybody. So it helps you move towards a place where people aren't being left out or being disrespected, or you're not accidentally doing something painful. Like in the book, I have a story where I had just given one of my foundational anti-bias workshops at a tech company. And somebody emailed me to say, I can't believe this got posted. And it was these dictator Valentines that somebody made a joke and posted on Slack. I know dictators are wrong, but this humor is just so right, blah, blah, blah. So they knew it was a thing. And so there are these dictator Valentines, which to this person were just funny, right? The person who had posted. So there are things like, oh, I can't even think of them. They're just puns on dictator names, right? So like Stalin and Mao and Idi Amin. But this person who had emailed me, her parents had survived the Cultural Revolution. So for her, Mao is a source of grief, of pain, of very personal stories of parents starving almost to death, of people like, Mao isn't like some hilarious Andy Warhol print or like a meme or something. This is like a real thing. And so she just wanted to log on to work and, onto Slack and have a day. And this person was like, well, I know it might be wrong, but for that person who had posted, they had never been personally affected by any of the people in question. So something that was light and fluffy for one group of people was actually could be deeply painful for another group of people. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
And that speaks to the privilege that people have when the workplace has been historically designed for you by people like you.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that's funny to you, you don't realize how much pain that it can evoke in somebody else that's been historically marginalized, which one of the things, Suzanne, that I think we both probably can relate on is when we're in the room, people are like, oh, what can I like say or do? Oh, the diversity police are coming for me. I mean, I have family members. It's holiday time, so oh geez. Like I can't
Yeah.
say or do anything around you
Yeah.
anymore. I have to watch everything I say. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm just asking you to use language that's respectful and inclusive. My hope is that you would want that. And but they don't understand it because they say, well, it doesn't offend me. These dictator memes don't affect
Right.
me because I haven't been impacted by it. Help our listeners. How do you defend yourself in that situation? Or maybe it's not even defending yourself, just
Right.
how do we use that opportunity?
Right. So I just gave a virtual talk at an HR conference and they just sent me the chat and your biggest takeaway data. So I was just looking through that now. I couldn't be there for the chat because I was actually giving a keynote at the same time. It was very strange. So I was supposed to be there for the chat, but I was like, you can't schedule me for the moment that I'm literally on stage, right? I can't do that. So one of the biggest takeaways that people had is the thing that I'm going to share with you right now, which is the idea of a flavor of a word as opposed to the dictionary meaning. So for a lot of people, we were raised before I went to grad school, I thought very similarly, the dictionary is like the ultimate authority on language. So if I point to a word in the dictionary and it's fine, then it's okay to use, like articulate or exotic or professional, or if executive presence was in the dictionary, right? All of these things, right? So there's this guy named Mikhail Bakhtin. I give you permission, listener, if you cannot say ha, I grew up with a native ha. If you did not, I'm giving you permission to just say a K. So you can say Mikhail Bakhtin, right? But because I speak Russian, I have to say Mikhail Bakhtin. So he was this brilliant, brilliant researcher in Russia who was studying novels and came up with these fantastic linguistic and linguistic anthropology concepts. And he made it clear to us when the Iron Curtain came down, we started to read more stuff. He made it clear to us that words aren't objective and neutral and just out there in the world existing, that each word has its own flavor that we accumulate individually over the course of our lifetime. So every single time somebody says something to us, the word acquires a flavor. And some words are very neutral, like the or table. It's like whatever, they've got the same flavor for everybody. But other words, depending on how you encountered them, maybe it's a word that your parent who yelled at you a lot used when they were yelling at you. So that word just gives you stress responses. Or the example I give in the book is exotic, right? So this is one I take personally, but I hear it also when I run interviews with people, especially at tech companies, right? So exotic is a word. If it's never been applied to you, it has probably a mildly positive flavor, right? Oh, exotic food. Oh, exotic location. Like it's foreign. Maybe it's spiced differently or it looks different. And like if I travel, I'm like, oh, it's so exotic here. It's so cool, right? But for many people, and I'm ambiguously ethnic, so I'm often in spaces that are all white, and I'm technically white, but I'm not seen as white. In many places, people have said to me, "Oh, you're so exotic," right? I mean, American people. I mean, like a person who grew up 15 miles away from me talking to me at a lunch. I still remember, and it's 20 years ago, and I still remember this lunch. And he was like, "Ooh, you're so exotic," and I'm like, "You dude, you grew up 15 minutes on Long Island, like." I also grew up on Long Island, 15 minutes away from you. I'm not exotic, right? But there's this way that it's applied in a way that others that highlights difference. And for women, it's usually used for women. It can be very sexualizing, right? In a time
Mhm.
that you don't want it to be sexualizing. So there are a lot of people use the word cringe. There are a lot of people for whom the word exotic is cringe because for them, the flavor is, oh, somebody's going to point out how sexy I am when I'm just trying to work, or someone's going to point out how dark skinned I am when I just want to work, or someone's going to point out that I speak English with a foreign accent when I just want to work, right? So the idea of flavor helps us understand that one person might say, well, I wouldn't mind if someone said it to me, right? Flavor demolishes that argument because it says the flavor for you is fine. But just because the flavor for you is fine doesn't mean the flavor is fine for everybody else. And this is part of the idea of respect, right? It's like, oh my goodness, like back to childhood, like wet wiggies or what willies or like noogies or like all of these things that people do. Well, I don't mind if somebody sticks a wet finger in my ear, probably not. But like somebody can accept, like I know, but for me, it's really terrible. Like you really can't do that, right? I'm now thinking about all the things. I have a younger brother. I'm going through all the torturous things that he did, and I'm not going to talk about them. But like he's like, well, I wouldn't mind if you took off your socks and waved them at me. Well, it's like my socks don't smell like your socks, right? So I think this idea of flavor is very easy to understand and immediately helps us demolish that argument because it's saying, well, the dictionary doesn't tell us everything, right?
Mhm.
The flavor, and for me, the flavor is bad because the way I've encountered it gave it a bad taste. So
I love that.
can you avoid that?
Yeah. And it brings us to one of the lenses that's so hard to do, but if we only stay more curious and empathize a bit more, we can go beyond our lived experience.
Mm,
This is something you and I struggle with a lot in, very white male-dominated spaces when talking about DEI. Well, that didn't happen to me. If someone calls me articulate or professional, like that's great.
yeah,
But if you're a woman of color and it's been used as a surprise to you historically,
yeah.
or it's been used as against you, even in coaching, or told you're not enough of this, or that your hair is a certain way, you're going to have a different flavor for that word. So I really appreciate you bringing that to mind. One of the things I'm curious that I know you didn't write about in the book, but you've been doing keynotes, taking deeper dives
Mm,
into our historical, like how we learn these language
mm,
models. And,
mm.
we know that, when you learn a foreign language or another language, you learn a language. It's better if you learn very young because their language models, how they develop over time. How does inclusive language work with regards to how our brains and our language models change over time?
So, one thing that happens is, so a thing I've been talking about a lot recently, I'm talking to you having just coming home, just come home after giving a keynote in Milwaukee to a women's philanthropic organization that really wanted to go deeper. And so I've organized the whole talk on the difference between the things our conscious minds think and what our language patterns say, right? And so, especially when there's something grammatical, let's talk about pronouns briefly, right? If there's something grammatical, our grammar for our native languages gets fixed around puberty, which is why I think it's so hilarious that in the US, we're like, we say to immigrants, only speak English at home. And then we're like, oh, let's start teaching kids foreign languages exactly at the very hardest time to learn a language, right? If they had just been learning it at home, I mean, I've had top security clearance. It can be a national security issue when you don't, when suddenly a country is a country of interest and you don't have US citizens who speak the language because we told people stop speaking this language to their kids, either implicitly or explicitly. All right. So pronouns, we're getting a generation of kids who have a shift in the pronoun grammar that people my age, I'm Gen X. I was raised with language that has a pattern that says there are only two genders, that gender is binary. Everybody's either male or female, and a few select people might undergo painful and difficult surgery to move from one to the other, and that's it. So it shows up in pronouns. If there's a single person, you're going to refer to them as either a he or a she, and then the related declensions that go through. Sorry, linguistic terminology, but her, hers, all of that stuff. So, and then it also sneaks in other subtle ways that people are surprised to hear about. For example, the opposite sex, right? So the idea of the opposite sex says there are only two genders, and it's like they're flip sides of one coin, right? Either one or the other. And so that's a subtle one. So there are ways that these ideas of the binary, I was on the train from Milwaukee to Chicago, and the conductor kept on saying, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. And I just had a podcast with a transgender person who has they, them pronouns. And that person said, I'm so over ladies and gentlemen as the intro that supposedly reflects everybody. So there are all of these ways that these things permeate. And so for young people who are learning the new system, sometimes the language patterns shift to be more inclusive. So we've got my friend's 7-year-old, they, thems all over the place, unproblematically for a single known person. Whereas his mom, who's my friend, struggles the way I do. And so there are lots of ways that we can have this idea. I know this person is non-binary. I know this person is referred to using they, them. And then your language patterns, especially we go on autopilot so much, out of your mouth comes the way that you've done it literally millions of times. You're going against the weight of literally millions of times. So that's why in the book, I'm like, you have to practice. Like you have to practice. And I give exercises to be like, practice in the privacy of your own home. Talk to a practice partner, like an exercise partner, or talk to your pet about non-binary celebrities. There are ways that we can shift those patterns. Let me pause there because there's other pattern stuff I want to talk about, but let me see if you
Well,
let
I was
me
just
you
about to say,
want to
I
jump
was just going
in.
to jump in because when I read that part of your book, doing this work, I feel so guilty that
Yeah.
I go to he, she way more often than they, them. And so it's
Yeah.
something I'm really conscious about. But what it stems from me is third grade English class. It was very clear that singular has to be he or she,
Yeah.
and they, them was always plural.
Yeah.
And so when you said that about the language models, my 8-year-old brain that
Yeah.
was forming and understanding language understood that that is a rule you do not break. Even though I know that the AP style book has changed that sense and kids are being taught differently, I still go back to my inner child's understanding of that word.
And a person with authority told you explicitly, this is how it is. And if you don't do it this way, you get penalized. You get
Yeah.
a bad grade. It's wrong. You literally get a red X because it's wrong. And it's very hard to undo that stuff. So I'll tell you, I mean, this is more linguistic than I plan on getting, but let's just roll with it. We did it once already in English with you, right? We did it. So if we had been, I'm desperate to find, but there are very few historical linguists now because departments have decided historical linguistics is not that interesting. I started out as a historical linguist, interested in language shift, and that's how I backed into my field. But I would love to find a few hundred years ago people griping about young people saying you instead of thee and thou. I would love to hear it. I'm sure there are people like, oh, young people these days, so rude, so stupid. They sound so French. We're not saying vous, we're saying thou. Like, well, like there's all of these ways that I'm sure it happened. But we have the benefit of the grammar changed before us. So we have singular you and plural you, and we're fine with it because that's what our brains did. So guess what? In 40 years, the change will already have happened, 50 years. And people are like, people used to struggle with singular they. Like, what's the problem? So we're just happen to be, when you're at a time of change, it can be very stressful. And so I think what we have to do is give grace to ourselves and grace to other people. And sort of, if you let people know that you're really putting in the work, then the mistakes aren't that important, right? That's the thing. If you've got that framework down where you've made it clear that you have good intentions, genuinely clear. And by the way, good intentions isn't making the same mistake 100 times with your non-binary report, or 100 times, like that's just not bothering to put in effort, right? But if you every once in a while slip up, like I've talked to some non-binary people who say to me, and then they make the biggest deal out of it. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I keep on forgetting that you're non-binary. It's so rare. They go on and on and on. So if your goal is to make somebody feel included and not othered, well, that's not useful either, right? So we don't want to over apologize, but we want to give ourselves grace, especially if you're fighting against grammatical patterns that were lodged in your brain that are very, very hard to change. And we want to give other people grace. It's that balance between grace and accountability that I think we find throughout DEIing in general.
Oh, for sure. No, and I love how you laid that out. One, if people know that you're trying, they're going to give you more grace.
Mm.
Shame is not a helpful way to motivate behavior change. So we should try not to use that as allies. And if somebody's willing to do the work, put in the work to get better, even if they make mistakes, to your point, you don't get a free pass to keep making the same mistake or just to continuously make mistakes in general. You have to be open to that feedback and coaching. Doing this work, Suzanne, I'm curious. We've mentioned some of the trigger words or for lack of a better word, do's and don'ts with inclusive language. What do you hear most often? I mean, we've talked about pronouns, we talked about professionalism, and I love the excerpt in your book about what does it mean to be professional, which, by the way, is a fascinating exercise to do with your team and your organization, because there's
Absolutely.
lots of privilege wrapped up in what that looks like. But I'd love for you to just unpack, if you could leave our listeners with some kind of words that tend to be more inclusive, words that you hear that they don't want to really repeat them, but keep your radar up. I talk about allyship as you got to keep your radar working. These are educational moments when you hear these types of words.
So, definitely pronouns and language that assumes the binary is the stuff that I would say people are most touchy sounds bad, but a lot of people during the pandemic were able to get in touch with a gender identity that isn't one they were assigned at birth. And as with any new thing, when you've made a shift, a lot of people are so uncomfortable, and it's so easy to make somebody feel bad. I mean, the suicidal ideation rates for transgender and non-binary kids are super, super high, super high. So anything that we can do to soften that and have people feel like, I see you, I accept you, you're valuable to me. I would say because the gender stuff is so under attack and so many people are already feeling so bad, that's my number one thing to really put your attention into. I would say a thing that surprises people is how much inappropriate use of Native American terminology there is. So yeah, I'm seeing
I
a
mean,
little
and
eye
our
roll.
sports allows it to be on
I know,
display. I mean, I
I
can't
know.
watch a Kansas City Chiefs game and watch that. It's just terrible.
It's a little astonishing. And if you compare it to, a lot of Americans are knowledgeable of their European heritage, and where it came from. So they can have ethnic identification. Sometimes people are like, well, why are we capitalizing Black for Black? And I'm like, well, a lot of Black people would love to know their ethnic identification, but that's information that was stripped away from them when their four people were stolen and enslaved, right? And forced to shift to English and all of these other things, right? So a lot of heritage was removed. So a lot of people I know would much prefer to not have a a slave owner's last name as their last name and would much prefer to have something more specific, like, oh, I'm Awe and Twee. Like a lot of people I know would love to know that. And genetics is finally a little bit bringing us back to that. But so there's this, I mean, I'm just going to say egregious stuff for sports, but I'm like, would you like it to be like the Kansas City Italians or the Kansas City Wops? Or, like, would you be, or this idea when you talk about Europe, a lot of people, again, so oriented towards Europe, but I'm like, if you talk about Native Americans as if they were this monolith, the Native Americans used to a monolith that no longer exists, when it's not a monolith, hundreds of languages and cultural specificity, like specific cultures, right? Throughout the United States, throughout First Nations people, throughout Canada, throughout Mexico, right? A fully populated location when Europeans arrived. But people will say the Native Americans used to, or Native Americans this. And I'm like, it's like if you described French people as if they're German, right? Like Europeans all love beer, are very prompt, work, like there are all these ways that then it starts to come in, right? So there are all of these ways that people have said to me, oh, I'm so surprised. I did an advice column. People email me with questions and I turn it into a monthly advice column. And somebody from high school, I have not talked to since high school. Literally, I've not seen this person from high school, but she reached out on LinkedIn and said, hey, I must have the natives are restless in the meeting the other day. And then I thought, hey, maybe I shouldn't. What do you think? And I'm like, ooh, let me explain why that's not okay. And it set up this model of like a colonial ruler who knows better. And like, maybe let's throw a little sop to the natives so they don't notice that we're stealing all their resources and subjugating them, blah, blah, blah. And then I went through, because natives can mean here, indigenous people here, but it can mean indigenous people elsewhere. But I'm like, if we're going to talk about American indigeneity, here's a bunch of stuff you shouldn't be saying. Like, let's have a powwow, bury the hatchet, offer the peace pipe, spirit animal. I see a lot of young people saying spirit animal, and I'm like, ooh, you got to find another word for that, because spirit animal or spirit quest. Spirit quest is a very specific thing for some people, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about with, or in the book, I also talk about with indigeneity, the idea of a founding date or a settling date, right? So when I go to a new place, I always Google, when was such and such settled, right? Not founded, but settled, right? And people are like, oh, 1850s. I live in Oakland. So there, I get a lot of gold rush period thing. 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. I'm like, or was it at least 22,000 years ago based on footprints they just found in New Mexico? Or like, was it, there's this whole erasure that happens again and again by people who, it's just so innocuous. Oh, this is when this was founded. Well, this is when your settlement of European descent was founded, but there were plenty of settlements nearby, or perhaps even the same location. So that's just a starting point, I would say. So to sum up, gender and indigeneity, I would say, are the top two things right now I would recommend that people put their focus on, because they are surprisingly erased. Non-binary people and indigenous people are erased in all kinds of ways through our language patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are two really good ones to start with. And to your point, practice with your team, practice with somebody you feel safe with that can. I find when I'm trying to shift my language, trying to shift, a dozen words or phrases, like that's just my brain can't handle it, right? And I'm not setting myself up for success. And focus on the words you want to say more versus the words you want to say less. There's also some truth to this. When we focus on the things we don't want to say, we end up actually saying them more. So that's one of the things that I struggle with when people always want the do's and don'ts. I'm like, I really don't want to like continue to proliferate these negative words. But the one I hear most often, Suzanne, and I get the most pushback on, I'm sure not going to be surprised. Guys.
Ooh.
I show that I have like a inclusive, like do's and don'ts, very basic, not nearly as sophisticated as yours because it's a part of an allyship program. But I get, you speak about people that their one takeaway is, I'm going to work on not saying guys anymore. Like, that's what you took away from this whole thing. But okay, because that feels really tangible.
I
Can
mean,
you just give
and
us a little bit of a lesson on
yeah,
how to
sure. And the
frame
thing
that?
is, absolutely. And I'll say, first of all, a thing I say to people, a thing I say in the book is that inclusive language skills, acquiring any language skills requires practice. So if you're going to learn a foreign language, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to practice, and then your mistakes will get fewer and fewer. Same for inclusive language, right? It's not some, like, the brain acquires language slowly, requires practice. And when you go on autopilot, if you haven't practiced the heck out of something, you're going to go back to your old ways, right? So you just have to practice until you got a new habit. So that's one thing. So guys, I know people, I was talking about this on TV in Milwaukee the other day, and um the reporter usually does the handoff and says, "Thanks, guys." And then she said, "Thanks." It's like she changed what it was. She said, "Guess why I changed it?" So there are things I just like giving the terms in case there's sometimes people are word nerds, right? And they're happy to hear the term. So there's a thing called the semantic heuristic where you run a test on the semantics of a word, right? But we can just say scenarios, right? So the scenario I talked about on TV. So the question is guys really a substitute for people? People will argue. People, I get pushback. People email me. I was told. I'm like, you don't have to be told. Just run the test yourself, right? Guys is gender neutral. So guys is gender inclusive or gender neutral. So if guys is gender neutral or inclusive, you can substitute guy for people, person, and guys for people, right? So I'm going to the bathroom in a restaurant and I walk down the hallway and the first door I see says guys. Do I say, "Oh, gender inclusive bathroom," and go in? Absolutely not. I keep on going and I look for girls or dolls or gals, right? Because that's how it's set up. If I'm standing across the street from two people at a table and I say to my friend, who's the guy sitting at the table over there? Because I think I know him, right? She doesn't say to me, "The guy on the left in the suit and tie," or "the guy on the right in the necklace and t-shirt and skirt." She knows that I mean the person who seems to be male, right? And then the third one, now I can't really think about what was the third one that I give. Guys. Anyway, I want to give a comparison. I've got a third one that I'm blanking on right now, but I'll give you the comparison that I've started introducing, which is the word girl. Okay. So girl, like let's say it's 1350, girl means child. Girl means any young person. So if I say to somebody, "Who's that girl over there in the corner?" They'll be like, "The girl in the dress or the girl in the whatever tunic," right? Because it can mean young male child or young female child. But over the intervening centuries, girls has undergone a shift. And so we talk about what words point to in the world, right? Girl used to point to in the world any young person, and now it means specifically a young female person. In fact, if you're pointing to a boy and refer to him as a girl, we understand it's an insult because calling a male person a female word is clearly insulting, right? For any, "Hey, ladies, how, like a coach comes into the locker room. All right, ladies, what are we going to do next in the next half?" Okay. So girl has completely changed what we call the referent, what it points to in the world, and now is gender specific for female people. So we know what it feels like when a word has truly gone through a semantic change and points to either all genders or one kind of gender. So we see that girl absolutely has done it and guy absolutely has not. And I say to people, I'm so sorry because this is one. The other one that I think is very, very hard to pull out, and I'm always apologetic, is mental health terms. So in the US, a lot of places, we use mental health terms very, very loosely and there are reasons in the book I lay out. There are real reasons because they lend a real spice and punchiness to our language. The flavor of these mental health terms is really strong. And when we want something to sound really strong, then it makes so much sense to use it. But for people, this is the recognized pain points. There are a lot of people, when I was a professor, there were so many people who looked so carefree and happy and good looking, and they were young and carefree. And then they would come to my office and story after story after story of terrible pain. "I need an extension because of this." I won't even tell you, but it's like, and some of that pain was their own clinical depression. Some of it was mental illness on family members' behalf, all of these things. You cannot look at people and know if mental illness or mental health is a pain point for them. You can't know. And it's so stigmatized in this country that most people don't talk about it. So chances are excellent that if you're saying crazy or insane or she's so schizo or he's so psycho, or I have a colleague who her OCD diagnosis, she said, "Oh, I should tell you I'm OCD." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." said, I wouldn't have thought that. She goes, I didn't think it either, because all of the ways that OCD is presented and people talk about it have no relationship to my symptoms. So I had my symptoms and I was like, well, I can't, like, is it mental health? Like, she thought her symptoms, she didn't understand until she lucked into somebody who said to her, oh, I know someone who was diagnosed with OCD and that's what that is. So it really blocks diagnoses. So it's very easy to say, guys, every YouTube content creator I see is like, hey guys, and then you guys. And I'm like, oh, please, we have to stop. We have to stop, because there are people. I'll say one more thing. I'm collecting stories from salespeople. Salespeople are very resistant to inclusive language, very, very resistant. So, but I know that they need it, right? Because I am collecting stories of, I'm now up to like $15 million in lost revenue from like 5 words that were said, right? And so one of those words is guys, where I can think of 4 million that got lost by someone who said guy and he, your IT guy and he, at the very last meeting, $4 million down the drain because of that one thing that was said. And somebody who rescued, there was a room full of decision makers who were, a lot of them were women and a lot of them were transgender, because of this consortium that they were trying to sell this thing to. I think it was health, like a health plan or something. So gender actually very relevant, right? And this VP had come with him to sort of help out. He didn't really need help. And then kept on addressing the room as guys. And this person whose wife is a DEI consultant knew, right? And so during a break, he pulled him aside and he was like, dude, you have to go in. I'm going to beg you to go in and apologize for saying guys and say, I'm so sorry. It's come to my attention that I've been saying guys, and that's really not inclusive. What would you, I'm going to try to say everyone and folks, is there anything else? And he did it. Like, he forced, this guy was so resistant. I'm not going to do it. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to do it, says the VP. I'm not going to do it. Comes back in the room, does it. And then the salesperson watches as body language changes. And then some people say, we have been feeling really offended, but thank you for that apology. Accepted. Please use these words from now on. And that $3 million deal was saved, but it
Yeah.
almost went away. So,
Yeah. And I think that's the real risk of being irrelevant to the people you're trying to influence and do business with. This is about staying relevant. And there's this fear factor of like, gosh, I have to change everything I say and do now because I'm less relevant. I think people go to that zero-sum game mentality when you and I know, hey, it's going to land better. The thing I think about inclusive language is the more I say what I actually mean, and I don't use metaphors and things that people may not understand that actually mean sports analogies, war references. Like those
yeah.
just don't make sense to other people in other cultures. Say what you actually mean, and people are going to know and understand what you're actually trying to say. So this is an additive, not a subtractive. Um, just love all the tools you put together. I mean, as somebody that's so deep into this work, I know I walked away with tangible, actionable, great examples, great stories that I could share with my clients. And so I just thank you, Dr. Suzanne Wertheim. I just really appreciate the gift of the Inclusive Language Field Guide and highly recommend it, listeners, if you don't have a copy yet. It's a great team read, too. I think something I'm seeing in the holiday season is a great opportunity to all get a book together. I know my team's going to talk about something in January. Just let's learn together and create an inclusive experience around this and lower the fear, because inclusive language shouldn't be a scary topic.
But so many people are so stressed out. When I explain the book to them, so many people literally sag with relief with what I'm telling them. I've seen so many people's body language just literally like lean down because they've been carrying so much stress. I'm like, it doesn't have to be stressful. And you can just a little bit of practice and someone safe to practice with and someone safe to talk to. And I've got a whole discussion guide, and you can do activities together as a team and just knock out one thing at a time, just one little thing, and practice it. It shouldn't be terrifying. And that's why I'm saying I dove through all the science and all the data to get to something really basic. And so you can just take that basic stuff then and really start to feel more confident and more powerful. So I'm looking forward to people feeling better about inclusive language and taking those small
Yeah.
steps to change. So thank you.
Great point. The discussion guide does the work for you. So just take it into bite-sized chunks, take a principle a month.
Yep.
This is a practice. I think too, and the DEI news cycle, being election year, there's going to be charged topics. Inclusive language to me seems very palatable. Like we should at least be able to talk about this. So thank you for your work.
Thank
Suzanne,
you.
let our listeners know how they can follow your work.
Sure. So I'm easy to find at SuzanneWertheim.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. And people like to follow me on LinkedIn because I will often analyze something topical that happened using the principles of inclusive language that help you get a better grip on it. So LinkedIn, SuzanneWertheim.com. And I look forward to, and feel free to, by the way, reach out. I have that free monthly advice column. If you've got a question, ask. I always anonymize it. And there's a good chance if it's a good question, I'll answer it for free.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you again for your work. Really appreciate your voice in this world.
Thank you. It's been a delight to finally talk with you after all these years. So thank you so much.
Ditto. Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.